Hello and welcome to this video on causes of economic growth. Now, as we've learnt earlier in the course, we would measure economic growth by looking at changes in gross domestic product. And a reminder that gross domestic product, GDP, is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a year. It's normally estimated by governments and recorded in dollars so we can make comparisons between economies. But what we're going to think about is what causes economic growth. In this video, we're going to look at factors which could cause economic growth, distinguish between actual and potential economic growth, and then finally look at a few examples of how countries have achieved economic growth in different ways. So let's start off with actual economic growth. And by actual economic growth, we mean an increase in real GDP. And this tends to be caused by changes in aggregate demand. So an increase in one of the components of AD will cause an increase in real GDP, and we would say that changes in aggregate demand normally drive changes in actual growth. So short-term fluctuations in AD will cause the economic growth rate to vary. So for example here, a change in AD has led to economic growth of Y1 to Y2. So what might be common causes of changes in AD? Well, things like the wealth effect, changes to the level of interest rates, changes to tax and government spending plans, and then exchange rate changes. So things that would affect C, things that would affect I, things that would affect G, and things that would affect X minus M. Now, what does it depend on? The extent of the change on actual growth? Well, two things to consider. Firstly, the multiplier. The size of the multiplier will affect the change in the actual level of growth. And secondly, the shape of the AS curve. The classical view would consider there would be little change in actual growth for a change in aggregate demand, whereas the Keynesian view would suggest that there could be quite a significant change in actual growth with a change in demand. And so these are two good evaluation points that we can use to evaluate any time in which we talk about changes in economic growth. Let's now talk about potential economic growth. And potential growth relates not to a change in real GDP, but to an increase in the productive capacity of the economy. So an increase in how much the economy could produce. And here we're thinking more about the factors of production or the potential aggregate supply within the economy. So increasing the quantity or quality of the inputs will enable national output to increase potentially. So an increase in land, labour, capital, or entrepreneurship. So causes of potential economic growth can be through improved quantity or quality of the factors of production, also by an increase in aggregate supply. So as AS shifts right, more can potentially be produced. And what this is equivalent to is effectively shifting out the PPF, the production possibility frontier. So these would all be ways in which we would demonstrate the potential economic growth or the potential of the economy growing. So how might an economy increase the quantity or quality of the factors of production, land, labour, capital and entrepreneurship? Let's consider a few issues. So in terms of labour, changes in demography, so changing the makeup of society, so the rate of new births, the number of pensioners, maybe increases in workforce participation, maybe things like immigration, emigration would be key issues to consider under labour. Under capital, we might think about the quality of investment and whether this will impact output. So is the capital new housing or is the capital new factories? We might also think about the technology and innovation within the economy, so how improvements can impact the combination of the factors of production and therefore improve efficiency. So we talked about economic growth. Let's also think about some constraints to economic growth. So it might be a different way of approaching the question. Well, these might be causes of economic growth, but actually there might be some constraints to economic growth that we can consider from a different viewpoint. So for example, constraints to demand or insufficient demand might be to do with the components of demand and therefore a fall in one or more of these terms. In terms of supply, maybe the potential production level of the economy ceases to increase, AS stops shifting to the right, possibly shift to the left. So some key issues to consider here within an economy. First of all, maybe the absence of capital markets. If people are and businesses are unable to borrow and invest, this might constrain or limit economic growth. If there are problems with the government and its stability, so poor policies or corruption or war, again, these may all hinder demand and supply within an economy. Labour markets, a shortage of skilled labour, or maybe emigration as people leave an economy looking for jobs elsewhere, like brain drain or falling birth rates, again might constrain potential economic growth. Perhaps a lack of access to markets, so maybe not being able to export overseas would again constrain economic growth. So falling birth rates and aging population, maybe demographic issues, finite resources or competition for resources from emerging economies might limit the potential production of the economy. And again, in terms of technology, might there be limits to innovation? Can we keep on inventing new technologies, come up with new ideas in which to do things more efficiently? So we've looked at factors which could cause economic growth. We've looked at the difference between actual and potential economic growth and some potential constraints to economic growth. The last thing is to look at some examples of countries and how they've achieved different growth rates. Let's start off with the UK. And if we look at the UK's economic growth, throughout the 90s, for a period of about 15 years, the UK's real GDP grew every year. So a very long period of economic growth from the late 80s or from the early 90s up until 2007, 2008. And what might be the reason behind that? Well, very low interest rates are considered one reason, and this enabled people to spend. So consumption really drove this economic growth. So we would say it was maybe demand-led, although there was some deregulation as well that created more freedom for businesses. Another story might be to look at the German growth story. Again, throughout the 80s and 90s, Germany experienced consistent, strong levels of economic growth. And how did they achieve this? Well, we would say this is more to do with the supply side of the economy. So it's more to do with the potential production levels. So lowering tax rates of businesses, reforming the labour markets, and investment in education and training enable the productive capacity of the economy to grow. And so we might argue the German growth story was more to do with the supply side. A final story might be to look at China. Again, impressive growth rates throughout the 90s and the noughties. And what would we ascribe this economic growth to? Well, they opened up to the global economy in the mid-80s and created a number of export-based industries. And this led to high levels of demand for their exports. And we would say China was really a story of export-led growth. So whereas the UK was to do with consumption, Germany was to do with supply, we might argue that China was to do with export-led growth. So we've looked at some different factors which could cause economic growth. We've looked at actual and potential economic growth and also what might constrain economic growth. And finally, we've touched on some different examples of how countries have achieved economic growth. That's all. Thanks for listening.